All right, so you have spoken about how people will often use words that don't actually describe what they advocate. They'll say, they'll be happy to say a murderer, a rapist, or a thief should be put in a cage, absolutely. Then you're like, well, what if I don't chip in for the welfare state or the warfare state, snort cocaine and hire a prostitute? Then they're like, oh, well, society needs laws. Like they're so uncomfortable with initiating violence that they can't even say the words. So in order to combat this, I have collected a statist speak dictionary list, and I'm going to give you a word, and you're going to tell me what the word actually means. We hear these words all the time. Tell us what they actually mean. Okay. Gun control.
That means the ruling class limiting what weapons can be owned by the people and using violence by way of agents who have guns to punish anybody who possesses an inanimate object that the politicians have declared they're not allowed to have.
Taxation.
Basically extortion under a nicer name, but prolonged extortion. So it isn't even just theft. It isn't even just one-time theft. It really is. Extortion is the better term than theft because it's prolonged. They do it over and over again.
Government.
Whoops, there was a glitch. I didn't hear that one.
Government.
That's a huge one. It's basically a term that a gang uses to describe itself to make people believe that it's legitimate and that the violent domination and extortion that it commits is legal and lawful and righteous and necessary for society, blah, blah, blah. It's basically the term for a gang to try to make the gang sound like good guys when they're not. They're violent parasites.
Amanda Rockwitz has a great Anarchapulco speech about government just being the biggest, smartest gang, and that's why we think they're legitimate. Country.
Basically the territorial jurisdiction of one of these gangs. And the reason it matters is because the ruling classes train their underlings to feel profound emotional loyalty to their plantation, to their livestock plantation, where they're actually, they're proud to be, basically they're proud to be subjugated by this ruling class. And they wave the flag representing the ruling class that dominates them. And they feel this profound emotional devotion to their own enslavement, basically like a plantation owner convincing his slaves that we're the best plantation and you're so lucky to be working on our plantation, which is one of the reasons I made the video called The Jones Plantation, which covers a lot more than that. But yeah, it's basically the turf of a ruling class, but people think it's some great club that makes us so special and unique.
What is regulation?
Basically euphemism for violent control. And it's regulate, like when somebody talks about a law, like laws and regulations are basically two terms for the same thing. But when somebody talks about law, they're usually meaning something pretty simple, like you're not allowed to do X or you have to do. Regulation tends to be a bazillion miles long and stupidly intricate, but it's still all just a threat of violence. Like the cliche people, the example that people use, like how many hundreds or thousands of pages of regulations are there about how you have to raise cabbage, I think it is, to sell it on the market in the US. And it's all just a gigantically, long-winded threat of violence. Is you have to jump through all these 8 bazillion hoops or we beat you up. That's the punchline. And it's, the fact that there are hundreds of pages that come before the punchline of or we beat you up doesn't change the fact that it's just a threat of violence.
What is a social safety net?
It's a totally bogus euphemism that for some reason doesn't include people voluntarily helping each other, but it only includes a ruling class forcibly extorting everyone to allegedly pay for people who need it, whether it's the elderly or the sick or the poor or the whatever else. But interestingly, when they use euphemisms, they leave out the moral legitimate versions, like people chipping in and charitably helping others voluntarily. And instead, they want to use that term just to apply to the violent government version, which is forced redistribution of wealth.
What do people mean when they say we should pass a law?
The funny thing is they don't know what they mean. To them, I know what they mean, but they don't most of the time. To them, it sort of means, well, there are these things called law. Society has these things called law that like lays down the rules of how we all should behave or what's good or something or other. And most people who talk about that, they're not even clear inside their own head about the fact that a law coming from government is always a threat of violence. It says you have to do this or you're not allowed to do that. And if you disobey and we catch you, we do nasty things to you. We hurt you. So when they say there ought to be a law, they're literally saying, they don't understand this, but they're literally saying we need the ruling class to issue a threat of violence about X. That's what it means to have a law about X. And even in the case where force is justified, like don't murder people or we'll use force to stop you, calling that a law still feeds into the weird statist notion that like we need politicians writing it down. Like I couldn't stop somebody from committing murder unless we quick run off to politicians and first have them write down on a piece of paper that they, the divine politicians, don't approve of murder, which is just silly. Stopping a murder, you don't need a badge, you don't need a law, you don't need special authority. As a human being, you already have the right to protect the innocent from the aggressors. And so the whole ritual of law is basically a way to try to legitimize violent domination. When people call for laws, they're calling for threats of violence and usually don't even know it.
Collateral damage.
Basically, either murder or negligent homicide committed by a ruling class's military that they don't want to call that. They want to pretend, well, it's just something that sort of happens. And so often you can point out the insanity and evil of statism just by changing the setting. So an example I use is if somebody says, yeah, there's a gang of 4 or 5 really bad dudes in my neighborhood, and don't worry, I did away with them by like strafing the neighborhood with machine gun fire for a month and then dropping bombs. And yeah, I killed like 100 other people, but that was a small price to pay because we got those 4 or 5 bad guys. The rest was collateral damage. Like in that context, nobody would say, oh, well, good for you. They say you're utterly insane and you're worse than the problem that you pretend to be fighting against. But if you call it that when it's blowing up brown people on the other side of the world, most Americans go, oh, well, I guess that was necessary, or they're doing their best to blah, blah, blah. But yeah, negligent homicide or murder, some of each is what is collateral damage.
And it's actually a little worse than that because it would be like you doing that because of the 4 or 5 thugs plus coercively funding the operation. And then when people ask you, what evidence do you have that the thugs were evil? You say, well, that's been classified for the next 50 years for your security.
Right. You're not allowed to know what I'm doing or why. You just have to take my word for it, and you have to pay for it. Right.
What is an executive order?
This is funny. This is a thing that came up recently. An executive order is a certain kind of bogus authoritarian decree. It can do one of 2 things. It can either only apply in the US, it can only apply to federal employees. It tells them how to do a job differently, or it can carry out authority, quote unquote, already delegated to the president by way of Congress. So they pretended to have the right to do something. They already said, we're going to give this right to do something to the president if and when he decides to do an executive order. A lot of people seem to think that you can just do anything with an executive order, and that's not really how they work. But it's just another layer of the bogus authoritarian garbage of them pretending to have magic, special, superhuman rights that you and I don't have. Because I don't like, for me to go do something that's inherently moral, I don't have to write an executive order first. By this executive order, I give myself permission to go stop the guy from stealing a little old lady's purse. Like, no, you don't need any such authority. So it's just another tool of immoral aggression. That's the only thing you need that for.
What is the draft or conscription?
That is the worst form of slavery that has ever existed. Because not only is it taking somebody's life and the fruits of their labor and effort, not only is it risking their life or taking their life, but it's forcing them to do pretty much the worst thing you could possibly do, which is murder and occasionally terrorism and stuff like that. And I'm happy to say that I don't think that if they're ever dumb enough to try the draft again, it will backfire very quickly, because at least humanity in this country has progressed to the point that if you say, yeah, you're a teenage kid, he has to go to the other side of the world to blow up people for us. I think we've at least reached a point where a lot of people, myself included, would not only say no, I'd be burning down draft offices. I would absolutely be sabotaging it in every way I could, hopefully without having to shoot anybody. But yeah, if they're all the way kidnapping American kids to go act as murderers on the other side of the world, it's bad enough that a bunch volunteered to do it. But if you're going to kidnap kids, I'm going to forcibly resist you.
One quick thing on the draft. It's not that unrealistic. Consider this. Rahm Emanuel under Obama on C-SPAN said, I support 2 years of mandatory service. He got this idea from our closest ally and only democracy in the Middle East, Israel, who has conscription and a draft. And Charlie Rangel, the senator from New York, has proposed conscription as well. So I totally agree with you. I just disagree that it might be a little more pertinent than you do. What do people mean by law of the land?
Once again, they don't know what they mean.
Yeah,
I'll tell you what they mean. They really picture as if in this place there's these magical rules that are like floating in the air of what we all have to live by, was threats made up by the politicians. It has nothing to do with the land. It has nothing to do with society. They'll also talk about how society has decided that we need 300 pages of regulations for growing cabbage. No, society decided no such thing. Society was duped into believing we need a ruling class, and then the ruling class made up this bogus stuff and called it law. And most people really and truly view those threats as if they are commands from on high, as if disobedience to them is a sin, instead of just, well, a gang of thugs made a threat. Maybe I can get away with disobeying, maybe not, whatever. But the law is no more legitimate than the demand of an average street gang, but people have been trained to think that it is.
What does it mean to commit a crime?
It depends who you ask. In the mind of the average statist, it means disobeying any of the arbitrary edicts of the ruling class. There are some of us who would only call it a crime if you have an actual victim, like actual bad behavior, like violent aggression. But to most people, it means disobeying any of the bogus stuff that the ruling class makes up and calls law.
What does it mean when someone says the military defends the country?
It means they don't nearly understand reality. Well, as with everything, the ruling class always has to pretend that it's serving the people. They can't just come along and say, we're going to violently subjugate you and rob you because, well, we feel like it and we like power and money. They have to pretend to be serving the people. So they have this giant war machine that's off doing its imperialist routine, and they have to pretend that that's defense. And that's been true of every regime, including the most, obviously tyrannical regimes around. Mainly I use Nazi Germany because it's the one Americans have heard of, even though it's only like third worst as far as body count. But the Nazis pretended they were just defending themselves too, and they invaded Poland and they invaded France and kill people and blow things up. They always have to pretend that their violent aggression they do with their military is defensive, because otherwise they couldn't get soldiers and their citizens to go along with it. So they have to paint it as defense. Nothing the U.S. government has done in my lifetime called a defense of the country. Notice how rarely there's like a day in the War of 1812 when the British came into Michigan, I think. That was like the only thing you could have pretended was actually defending the country. But yeah, it's a euphemism for violent aggression by the military.
Yeah, in your most recent video, Socialism, Expectation versus Reality, you just read the Soviet Constitution and it's like, do you really think evil people will come out and say, let's go kill innocent people just for power. No, of course they always spice it up to sell to the public, and nothing says it more clearly. Or look at the Venezuelan Constitution of 1999. It doesn't say, well, within 15 years, everyone's going to be starving. No, it says everyone has a right to food and life, of course, obviously. What is free healthcare and education?
A total lie. Well, as it happens, those two things are specifically in the Constitution of the Soviet Union, that people have a right to education and a right to free healthcare, just like Bernie presents. Of course, there isn't such thing as free any of that, because somebody's paying for it. What they mean is, we're going to force somebody else to pay for it, and you get it for free. And it's just, it's a very simple scam that the politicians run by telling people, hey, if you put us into power, we'll give you free stuff. And we don't really need to talk about how we're going to pay for it, which is by robbing other people. In fact, we're not going to mention the fact that it's also by robbing you. Like the free stuff we give you, we're also going to rob you to pay for it. It's just, it's a pathetically transparent sales pitch, and it's sad that it still works on so many people that they don't even take 2 seconds to say, wait, how do you pay for it? Where does it come from? They don't just make stuff appear. Somebody had to pay for this school building. School buildings don't build themselves. Doctors and hospitals don't just magically appear for free. Where's it coming from? But most Americans are so childish and immature in the way they look at the world. They just think, oh, Bernie wants to give me free stuff, let's put him into office, because they don't think 2 seconds past that to say, well, how do you pay for it? Well, by violence.
And then I saved my favorite one for last, the social contract.
The social contract is another one of the best excuses that tyrants have to commit violence. Again, it has a lot to do with, it goes along with the notion of voting, where it's like, you consented to this. Only the social contract is even more bizarre, because it basically says, well, by falling out of your mom on this piece of dirt, that counts as you agreeing for the rest of your life to be subjected to the arbitrary whims of the ruling class over in DC. It's just so patently stupid. And the funny thing is, it gives away a huge collectivist mentality and status, because what they're really saying is that they believe the politicians in DC own every square inch of this country, quote unquote. Because if they didn't, like, I don't get to say, hey, by living in your own house, you're agreeing to give me $100 a week. Like, what? No, you don't get to do that unless it's your house. So it really is people saying that they think the politicians own everything, and that us being on the politicians' property to go along with anything they say. And it's that bad. And then I wrote a thing not that long ago pointing out, if you accept that premise, then there's no such thing as unalienable rights anymore. Because if they own it, they can make up any damn rules they want. They can say, give us all your money or leave the country. What would the status objection be to that if he believes in the social contract, this magic thing you never agreed to? Well, if tomorrow politicians say, give us all your stuff or get out of the country, according to the social contract theory, that's perfectly legitimate. And we're all just all the way slaves or leave the continent.
Yeah, the name of the chapter, I think, is Thinking Differently, Talking Differently. It's towards the end of the book. Yeah, definitely buy the book. At least watch the Thinking Differently, Talking Differently playlist video I have. In the link below, please share. We can spread the ideas without having to 1776 ourselves and then totally rise up. It's a very low-cost way of fighting for freedom.
This is the future, and I'm very, very excited to be standing here and looking out at it. So I'm going to put forward an argument tonight, and shockingly, you haven't heard it before, even if you've listened to a lot of my shows. We were just before I came up, we were just talking about how long I should go, and for those who know the number of podcasts I've done, what we've arranged is that there's a guy with a blow dart at the back. So what's going to happen, you'll hear a little, and then I'll just start to slow down, and I'll fight it. No! So, I wanted to talk about an idea that I've been working on. I've been doing this sort of stuff for about 25 years. And probably like most of you, for the first 20 of those years, I really, really thought that people disagreed with me about freedom. I thought that they were pro-government, I thought they were pro-taxation, I thought they were pro-regulation, pro-jail. Hi, darling. Yeah, you're upside down. Good girl. I can't believe I'm upstaged by my own daughter. Good girl. Yeah, get used to it. No kidding. And so I thought that people really disagreed with me, because whenever I would talk about freedom and voluntarism and non-violent solutions to social problems, people would really violently disagree with me. But I changed my mind shortly before I started Freedom Made Radio. And it was one of the reasons that I began doing the podcast. Was I changed my mind and I realized that people really do agree with us in a very powerful way, and I want to outline that tonight, and then with your participation and some Q&A, we'll see if we can hammer this out and see whether it's a good idea or the other kind. So, you know, when you're comfortable with something morally, you don't use weird weasel words for it, right? So, let's take an example, like you're out here in the woods and some very enterprising and dexterous bear comes at you with a chainsaw. I'm from the city. I think this happens. And let's say that, like most people here, you're heavily armed. Well, what you do is you shoot the bear, right? And hopefully you'd shoot it so you just wounded it, or so it could still make a nice rug or something, but you would shoot the bear. And if somebody said, well, what did you do later? You'd say, well, the bear came at me with a chainsaw, so I shot it. You wouldn't say, I nationalized it, I arrested it. You'd say, I shot it. Why? Because you'd be comfortable with the ethics of what you were doing, self-defense. Similarly, if somebody stole your bike and you saw it and they weren't around, you would take it back, right? And somebody said, well, what did you do? Well, I stole the bike back. I took the bike back. Right? You wouldn't say, well, I redistributed the bike back to the more needy or something like that. You would say, I took the bike back. Because you'd be comfortable with the restoration of your property. So when we're comfortable with something morally, we call it by its proper name. And I think that's really, really important. Because whenever you hear about the government, all you hear are these weird, weaselly, foggy, nonsense terms that don't describe anything real. I asked some of the listeners to my show, and I'll ask you now too, what are your favorite government euphemisms? My favorite so far is when you print a lot of, well, you print more fiat currency. They call it quantitative easing, which to my mind sounds exactly like a laxative, and not even one that you take orally. So, what do you guys say? What are your favorite government euphemisms? And I'll tell you why I'm bringing this up in just a sec. Quantitative easing is mine. I like No Child Left Behind, because if you argue against that, people think that you want to just throw throw children out of your car or something like that, and leave them behind. You know, they're slow, they're needy. So, what are your favorite government euphemisms out there? What do we got? National security. National security, as if there's a nation and as if it can be made secure through the initiation of force. What else have we got?
Common good.
What?
Public education.
Public education. What is that? Forced indoctrination would be the real term. There's a public education. What else we got?
Internal revenue service.
Internal revenue service. That's right. That's right. Because it's a service which you tip. Thank you. I love my creme brulee. Here's half my income. What else? What? Military intelligence. We weren't looking for oxymorons, we were looking for euphemisms, but thank you for trying. What else? What else?
Iraqi freedom.
Sorry? Operation Iraqi Freedom, right. You are free from plumbing. And your limbs. What else? Sorry? The Drug Enforcement Agency. That sounds like a lot more fun. You're going to take these drugs. And not orally. Sorry, I'm going to use that term more. I'm sorry?
Engage the target.
Engage the target. Will you die? Good point. Good point. What else? Oh yeah, the soldiers have fallen. Oops. No, they were killed. We can't even call that. Sorry?
Collateral damage.
Collateral damage. Yeah, that's a nice one too. You sunk my battleship.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah, because, you know, I watch people get killed and I'm not happy. What else?
Our soldier.
To serve and protect. Now, actually, I think that's not a euphemism because I think the police are there to serve and protect. Just not us. You know, the guys out front of the mafias, you know, hang out there to serve and protect as well, just not the shopkeepers they're shaking down. What else? One more. Who's got another doozy? Sorry?
Executive privilege.
We the people? We the game? Last one?
Executive privilege.
Executive privilege. Yeah, that's a nice one too. Yeah, I got a whole list of these here. Now, I think it's really important to understand why these terms are used. Why do people say military intelligence? Why do they say national defense rather than what it really is? Well, I would say that it's because they're really not very comfortable with what they're describing. Because when we are comfortable with what we're describing, we call it by its proper name. So, when it comes to helping people to escape the matrix of government language, because I think it's really important to understand that language is just another government program that is inflicted upon children through state schools, that is created by the government in its description of its own activities, right? So, Social Security. Can you really be against Social Security? Are you against society or security? Do you use your birthday as every single one of your passwords? Do you hate the term, the concept? It doesn't make any sense. So the government owns the language that is used to describe the government's activities. That's a real challenge. But the reason that people are drawn to that language is because they don't like what the government is doing, and so they need to cover it up with a whole bunch of nonsense syllables so that they can avoid looking at the thing itself. You know, it's like how the body falls and they cover it with a sheet. Well, the body is our freedom and the sheet is the language. If you understand that language, the language particularly of politics, is just another government program that does exactly the same as every other government program does, which is the opposite of its intended claim, right? The purpose of language is supposed to be to clarify, to communicate, to synthesize. And of course government language simply befogs and paralyzes and confuses and bewilders. And so, to take an example, right? So let's say that you're arguing about Social Security. I try as much as I can to avoid using the phrase Social Security. Because what do people think when they hear Social Security? Well, they think, well, that means food, shelter, and health care for old people. Who could be against that? What sane human being would say, no, that's no good, right? Let's pull an Eskimo and leave them on an ice floe. Right? That would make no sense. So you can't argue against Social Security because the language is owned by the government. Just like you can't argue against the Patriot Act because it means you're either against patriotism or action or something, but you're certainly not against what it actually is. So when I'm having conversations with people about something like Social Security, and they say, well, are you for or against Social Security? I say, well, I don't know because I don't really know what the term means. And what I mean by that is I don't know what the term means for the other person. I don't know if it means helping the old, or if it means the initiation of force with the intent of solving social problems. So I'll ask them what it means. Now, you usually get two answers back. So somebody says, I'm for Social Security because I am for helping the old and blah, 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 blah. And you have to say, well, look, that's not Social Security. Social Security is a specific set of laws and regulations and the tax code enforcements from the government. So it's not helping the old, because anybody can help the old who wants to. So Social Security is not helping the old. So you have to scrub that. If it's synonymous with helping the old, you'll never win the argument, because no sane person would argue against helping people. So somebody who maybe has a little bit more knowledge will say, well, Social Security is when the government takes some of your income while you're working, puts it in a nice, tiny little safe, and then when you're old, it gives it back to you. Now, somebody like that, they're lost in language. They don't, right? So if somebody's for that, then they're not for Social Security, because that's not what Social Security is, as we all know, right? Social Security is they take money from you, 20% or so, while you're working. They spend it on hookers and blow, Which is actually the safest thing. You know, people got mad at Spitzer for doing that. It's like, but at least he's not regulating people. It's the least of all himself. But, you know, the least harm is, but corruption is the least harm the government could do, because at least something or someone is getting done. So, if they're for, well, take the money and give it back to you when you're old, then they're not for Social Security. And so, it's really important to boil down what is actually happening, not the words that are used to describe it, that are invented by the government, and which will only serve to confuse the argument. So, what I like to do is say to people, who gets the gun in your system? In the system that you propose, who gets the gun?